Welcome to On the Other Hand. Should we have the death penalty? It's a question that many people have passionate opinions about, but funny enough, I don't. So I decided to dig into the subject and see if I stand distinctly on one side or the other. Fundamentally, I think the death penalty has staunch supporters and detractors because they see it as a moral issue with a clear answer. Those who are for the death penalty often cite justice, that there are some crimes so horrible that the offender needs to pay the ultimate price. Those who disagree might say that the state shouldn't be able to choose who lives and who dies, as mistakes will be made and innocent people will be put to death, thus robbing justice in the name of delivering justice. Once you get past that strictly moral layer, though, I think there are some other arguments for or against the death penalty. Questions about how much it costs, if it deters crime or not, and how prevalent it is. These aren't all the reasons, but these seem to be some of the strongest and most common arguments cited, so let's dive in. The cost of the death penalty is an interesting aspect. The Death Penalty Information Project lays out some basics on why cost is often a sticking point. Basically, those on death row can't generally afford lawyers, so the state, and thus the taxpayer, foot the bill for an extended legal battle for both prosecutors and defenders. And since the process is so serious, there are even more options for appeal than a normal criminal trial. And since the people in question are on death row, they have a very good incentive to fight as hard as possible and try everything to get off of death row. In short, extended legal battles with several lawyers adds up really fast and costs taxpayers hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars more than a typical non-death row inmate. As for deterrence, I thought this was a good summary of what I found. Quote, neither side can maintain that they have empirical support. In most years, most states execute no more than one, and the pattern seems to be on the rise. One cannot study the impact of executions when they are hardly ever imposed, and it is difficult to separate any impact of the death penalty from the large number of other factors that affect the amount and kinds of crime. Now I wanted to look at how common the death penalty is, and a little bit more on the organizations interested in death penalty cases and statistics. First, it's interesting to note that executions are becoming far less common. And since death row is such a long process, the spike in executions around the year 2000 could have been people who committed the crime years before, and the sentences also could be from years before. So there's kind of a disconnect from the causes and effects of death sentences. Anyway, just trying to say it's complicated. Next, I looked into how many people have been exonerated, and from the earlier cited Death Penalty Information Project, they claim there have been 185 exonerations. Thankfully, the organization has listed the individual cases, so you can go investigate for yourself. Here are a couple examples. In looking at these numbers, I wanted to get a better idea of how many executions happened versus exonerations versus people on death row in a given range, to better give context to all of these numbers. So, here's some of that information. Specifically, here's a graph showing the number of executions from 2000 to 2019, and here are the exonerations from those same years. And for reference, the number of inmates on death row according to the NAACP for the years 2017 through 2021 are 2,843, 2,743, 2,673, 2,603, and 2,504, respectively. As with most datasets, this is complicated. Are all those who were executed guilty, or were there some innocent people among them? For those who were exonerated, how many were actually not guilty, and how many were guilty and escaped justice? These are all excellent questions, and it goes back to the idea that it is better for 10 guilty men to go free than one innocent man to be punished. And how we look at this data will in large part depend on how much you personally or we as a society agree with that idea. One more thing I wanted to touch on was the bias of these various organizations. For example, both the NAACP and the Death Penalty Information Project seem to oppose the death penalty, so one wonders how much to trust some of their findings. As a reference point for bias, I ran into some information by the Innocence Project when researching, but I specifically didn't use them because they seem far more overtly partisan on this subject. For example, here is a clip of two people from the Innocence Project on Joe Rogan's podcast, talking in 2020 before Biden had chosen his running mate to be Kamala Harris.
Josh, you were talking about Kamala Harris, and I think this might be a good time to talk about this because she might be the vice presidential nominee. What specifically did she do where there was someone who was innocent or someone who was wrongfully convicted?
Let me give a caveat.
Okay.
Caveat is that I know all from some people that say you have to do everything you can to make sure that Trump is not elected. And I will say that even she's an improvement as vice president if he does pick her. Anything's an improvement in my mind. So with that caveat, it would take this podcast and 4 more to go through. She fiercely fought wrongful convictions and was shamed by judges when she was district attorney in San Francisco. What was the case? The Gage case?
George Gage.
The George Gage case, where her prosecutors hid evidence and they tried to protect. Once she knew that there was evidence that was withheld from defense attorneys, once she should have known, in my opinion, that people were innocent, she tried to protect those convictions. Why? Because she wanted to continue winning. She blocked DNA. She went to great lengths to try to block access to DNA for people that were accused of or convicted of felonies. Think about it. We're talking about a $12 DNA test to see if the biological material from a crime that has been preserved is actually the defendant's, right? She blocked access to that. I mean, the list.
How do you block access to something like that? That seems like that should be a right.
Yeah, it seems like it should be a right, but in a lot of states, there's legislation that says you cannot get access to it, and the rationale behind it is that it'll open up a floodgate of criminal defendants asking for the biological evidence in their case to be tested. I mean,
that's the last thing we would want is
Yeah.
more innocent people being freed. So what was her justification for this?
You know, when she's asked for her justification of it, it's always been on a debate stage, and she'll always default to, I stand by my record as a prosecutor, and she's never had an explanation that I have ever seen. I don't know, Jason and I were talking about this before we came on today, because there was a New York Times piece by, her name's escaping me.
Lara Bazelon,
which if any of your listeners want to listen to it, or she goes into, exhaustive detail about specific cases and things that Kamala Harris did. And, the sad part about it, yeah, that's it right there.
New York Times, Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor.
Yeah, she was often on the wrong side of history.
What is that? The highlight, the marijuana one that you just highlighted?
She stood by criminalizing marijuana in this state.
Now, listen, what we can hope is that she's certainly been saying all the right things lately. I don't know what to believe, to be honest.
Well, it's because she wants to be the president.
Well, okay, fair enough. I mean, I like to believe that people can evolve, and I hope that her viewpoints have evolved. Now she supports legalization, I believe, but the fact is it's impossible to ignore. And I hope Biden picks someone else personally, but, we'll see.
Biden ain't picking anything.
I will.
They're doing it for him at this point.
Well, I'll support him no matter what, who he picks. If he picks her, so be it, because I believe we're in an existential crisis.
So even when they were directly representing their anti-death penalty organization, they didn't care if they voted for a crooked prosecutor that they had hard evidence on, because the alternative was Trump. They didn't mention any reasons of why Trump was worse, or give any specific cases or documentation like they did with Harris. Instead, they put aside the literal goal of their organization on one of the biggest podcasts in the world to make a personal political statement. Like I said, this group is overtly partisan. Another red flag is where the Innocence Project actively lied when they recently got one Julius Jones off of death row. Here's some of the things they put up on their own website, but they literally just parroted his claims as if they were true without any due diligence or pushback. The case against Jones is airtight. He shot a man in cold blood in front of his young daughter in a carjacking, and despite DNA evidence, the daughter IDing him, and the guy's girlfriend testifying against him, the Innocence Project got him off of death row. Not on account of the facts of the case, but because they got enough people to believe their narrative despite the blatant omissions of facts. Actual Justice Warrior covered this topic amazingly well, and here's one of his best videos he has breaking down the case. Jones still has life without parole. I just find it disgusting that the people at the Innocence Project are malicious enough to try to get an objectively guilty man not only off of death row, but they were also calling for him to go free. It seems like they think that any means justify the ends of stopping capital punishment, or to stop a perceived political enemy, unrelated to their cause. Ultimately, I don't have an answer on if I support or oppose the death penalty. I can see the argument that heinous crimes deserve the death sentence, but I can also see the argument that the possibility of wrongful conviction is horrifying. I understand that it's expensive, and that it's not as common as it used to be, and that there aren't solid answers if it's a deterrent or not. To complicate it all, I have seen hard evidence that there are some prominent figures and groups that will lie about cases, and presumably numbers, to convince the public to get the outcomes they want. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you have an opinion on the death penalty? What's your primary reason for that opinion? Love to hear it down in the comments below. As always, thanks. Hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing or joining me on Odyssey, a great YouTube alternative. Link is in the description.